All right, so tonight we're talking about how did the opening of Japan hasten the end of the power of the shogun in Japan. And you're going to have to please forgive my very bare bones PowerPoint today. For some reason, my computer's being stupid and my PowerPoint is not opening and it's all corrupted. So we're going to have to deal with a very bare bones PowerPoint today. So we know we talked about China already. Some of you have already done essay on Japan. So we know a little bit about Japan and how Japan is going to develop in a way very different than the Chinese. In a lot of ways, basically, the Japanese did what the Chinese really should have done. They learned from the issues that China wound up facing from the Western powers kind of coming in. And so today we're going to see about how this whole process got started. So we're going to be focusing on three questions today. So we'll start with the first one. How did the changing economy lead to discontent with the government? So now you have to remember that Japan at this point was being ruled by what was called the Tokugawa shogunate. The Tokugawa shogunate. If you remember, we learned about this last year in 9A. So the Tokugawa shoguns ruled Japan for about 200 years. And prior to the Tokugawa shogunate coming in and taking over, Japan was ruled by a series of different kind of ruling feudal clans that were always kind of fighting with each other. And if you remember, Japan was essentially a feudal society. And then the Tokugawa shoguns come in, they're basically military dictators, and they manage to kind of centralize the government. One of the ways that they did this is by isolating the country from the rest of the world. So for 200 years, from 1603 to so more than 250 years, for about 250 years, Japan is going to be isolated. They're still going to trade with some people, like for instance, they're still going to be trading with China. They're still going to allow the Dutch to come in and trade. So out of the port of Nagasaki, which was on its own little separate island, the Dutch were able to come in and trade with the Japanese. So the Japanese kind of kept like a little bit of an eye on what was going on in the outside world, but for the most part, they were pretty much isolated. No one else was allowed to trade with them, which meant that they had to become dependent upon themselves. And remember, Japan is a country that does not have a lot of natural resources itself, so they really had to be very creative and become dependent upon themselves for all of their needs. So they actually had some of the largest cities in the world, and they had a growing manufacturing and commercial sector. And even though this is a society that follows in some ways Confucian ideals, and usually merchants are not valued, the merchants actually did gain quite a bit of political power within the country. But over time, as we see in most areas, the government began to become corrupt. There was a poor harvest. This sent many farmers off their land, so they kind of started to flood into the cities. The government responded by becoming very strict and harsh rather than trying to kind of fix these problems, rather than trying to come to the aid of the lower classes. They started passing more laws that were restricting their movement rather than trying to fix the problems of the lack of food. And basically they intensified their isolation with the outside world. And so let me erase this here. So that's going to take us to our second question, which is, why would the Western powers become so determined to open up Japan? Bottom line, they saw Japan as a challenge. The Western countries basically were competing with each other for places to expand their trading partners. By this point, they've gotten, they've expanded into China, they've expanded into India, they've expanded into Southeast Asia, they've expanded into parts of Africa. So it's kind of like Japan was one of the last frontiers, the last places where they could expand. So in 1853, a man by the name of Matthew Perry, he was a Commodore in the U.S. Navy. He comes into Tokyo Bay with 4 warships and basically demanded that Japan opens itself up. And so the Japanese government then was given a period of time to kind of discuss it and decide what they're going to do. We're going to be reading a couple of documents about this in class, and we're actually going to be reading the letter that our president, Millard Fillmore, actually sent to the Emperor of Japan. So the Japanese had about a couple of months to debate it. Some people felt that contact with the West would be basically politically and morally disadvantageous, would not be good for Japan. And others feared that the power that the U.S. military was willing to place upon the Japanese to kind of force them to give in. Because remember, they showed up with 4 warships, guns blazing, well, guns pointed at the city of Tokyo, which was called Edo at the time. So that takes us to the last question. This was going to be a very quick video. Why would the opening of Japan bring an end to the Tokugawa shogunate? So the Treaty of Kanagawa. So basically, the Japanese really essentially have no choice. They have to open themselves up. So they sign the Treaty of Kanagawa. So the Treaty of Kanagawa. They signed this with the U.S. And basically it opened up ports for U.S. trade and the establishment of a U.S. consulate. In addition, later treaties gave U.S. citizens in Japan the right of extraterritoriality, which you'll remember the British citizens got in China after the Treaty of Nanjing. So they got extra rights of territoriality. Now, once the U.S. got these rights, everyone else is going to start knocking on the door of Japan. The British, the French, the German, everyone's going to want to have a piece of it. So basically, Japan is kind of like pushed open, and it looks like Japan might go down the path that China does. But there was 2 regions, let me erase this, in southern Japan, because Japan was divided up into like separate states. Each in the past had been ruled by separate clans in the feudal period, and those families were the daimyos, if you remember from last year, the nobles of the area. So there were 2 territories in the south. One was called Satsuma. One was called Chosu. Together, they made the Sat-Chao Alliance. And they were not happy with the shogun's decision to open Japan up to the outside world. They were not happy with Westerners coming into Japan either. So what they decided to do is they decided to fire on Western ships, but they very also quickly realized that this was not going to work in their favor because the Westerners were able to respond very quickly, and the Sat-Chao Alliance was like, whoa, maybe trying to push the West out was not going to be the best path. But they still did not like the shogun. They still thought a lot of this was being brought about because of the shogun. So what they did in January of 1868, they overthrew the shogun and they restored the authority of the emperor in something that's going to be known as the Meiji Restoration. And that's an E right there. And we're going to talk about that more in the next slide. So like I said before, this was going to be a quick video, and then more for your video that you're going to be listening to tomorrow night for homework.